The moment influence became more powerful than authority. Power used to announce itself. It issued commands, and the world either followed or resisted. That world no longer exists. Today, the most consequential decisions in global finance are not enforced by authority. They are shaped by influence, quiet, distributed, and rarely visible. This matters now because the systems governing money have grown too complex, too interconnected, and too fast to be controlled by orders alone. What moves markets today is not instruction, but alignment. The shift from command to coordination happened gradually, but its consequences have been profound, reshaping how power operates in every financial center on the planet. To understand how this shift happened, we need to go back to a moment when authority began losing its grip. As finance expanded beyond borders, no single government could dictate outcomes without consequence. Capital learned to respond not to rules, but to conditions. It flowed toward stability, predictability, and confidence, regardless of who claimed control. London became one of the first places where this reality was fully absorbed. The city realized that issuing commands invited resistance, but shaping environments invited cooperation. Influence did not need to be loud. It needed to be credible. By setting standards others chose to follow, power stopped looking like authority at all. The transition was not philosophical. It was practical. The city discovered through experience that voluntary alignment produced more durable outcomes than enforced compliance, and that discovery reshaped how London exercised power across every dimension of finance. At first, this influence felt secondary. Governments still passed laws. Regulators still enforced rules. But beneath those structures, behavior was changing. Markets began anticipating rather than obeying. Institutions reacted not to orders, but to expectations. The system was learning to move itself. And once influence proved more effective than authority, the balance of power quietly shifted, without a single declaration. As influence replaced authority, control became less visible but more effective. Markets no longer waited for permission. They watched each other. They interpreted signals embedded in behavior rather than rules written on paper. A shift in tone mattered more than decree. A change in expectation mattered more than enforcement. Power moved into the space between decision and reaction. London adapted to this faster than most. The city understood that once authority weakened, legitimacy mattered more than force. If participants trusted the environment, they would align voluntarily. Influence emerged not from compulsion, but from consistency. When rules felt predictable, behavior stabilized without instruction. This transformation altered how institutions operated. Instead of issuing directives, they adjusted conditions. Liquidity was guided rather than commanded. Risk was shaped rather than prohibited. Influence worked indirectly, through incentives that felt natural rather than imposed. The distinction was critical, because participants who feel coerced seek escape, while participants who feel guided seek alignment. The result was subtle but profound. Markets stopped reacting defensively to control. They began cooperating instinctively. Alignment replaced obedience. Participants followed paths that appeared self-chosen, even when those paths had been carefully engineered. But this also created fragility, because influence relies on belief. And belief, unlike authority, cannot be enforced. Once confidence weakens, influence evaporates quickly. Authority can compel compliance even when trust is gone. Influence cannot. The system that learned to move itself also learned how easily it could lose direction. This tension sat quietly beneath modern finance. Power had become lighter, more efficient, and far more dependent on perception, which meant that maintaining influence now required constant calibration. Because once markets stop believing in the environment, no amount of quiet guidance can bring them back into alignment. The conflict emerges when influence is mistaken for permanence. As markets grew accustomed to alignment without enforcement, confidence hardened into assumption. Participants began believing the environment would always guide behavior smoothly. That stability would persist without intervention. That influence, once established, could sustain itself indefinitely. This was a dangerous illusion, because influence is not a structure, it is a condition, and conditions change. London experienced this tension first. The city watched moments when subtle guidance stopped working. when incentives no longer aligned cleanly, when participants interpreted the same signal differently. The system that once moved effortlessly began pulling in opposing directions. During stress, authority can act decisively. Influence cannot. It must persuade without speaking. It must stabilize without force. And when fear enters the system, persuasion weakens. Participants begin protecting themselves instead of the environment. Alignment fractures into caution. Caution hardens into withdrawal. The cooperative behavior, that influence cultivated during calm periods, dissolves under pressure, replaced by a self-preservation that no amount of subtle guidance can redirect. This is where influence faces its greatest test. Markets stop responding to expectation and start reacting to survival. The subtle mechanisms that once shaped behavior lose traction. Silence no longer reassures. Consistency no longer calms. The system demands something more visible, more concrete, but revealing influence risks destroying it. If guidance becomes explicit, it loses its power. If alignment feels forced, resistance returns. The very act of asserting control undermines the trust that made influence effective. London navigates this conflict carefully. It reinforces environments quietly. It restores credibility through action rather than declaration. Familiar processes are reactivated. Predictable behaviors are demonstrated. The city does not demand alignment. It invites recognition. But this balance is fragile. Because once influence fails to hold behavior together, authority must step back in. And authority always arrives louder than influence ever was. The climax arrives when influence proves it can still hold. At the moment when authority feels necessary, when pressure demands command and clarity, the system hesitates. And in that hesitation, influence is tested one final time. Will participants realign voluntarily, or will control have to return visibly? When influence works, the outcome is almost invisible. Markets slow without freezing. Behavior adjusts without instruction. Confidence rebuilds without announcement. London's strength lies in this restraint. The city understands that influence survives only if it remains subtle. It restores alignment not by issuing orders, but by demonstrating continuity. Processes behave as expected. Systems function under stress. Outcomes remain bounded. Participants recognize the familiar rhythm and fall back into step. This is the resolution of influence without authority. Not dominance, not silence, but credibility maintained under pressure. When influence holds, authority stays in the background. The system corrects itself without spectacle. Stability returns not because someone forced it, but because everyone recognized the same reality at the same time. But the lesson is clear. Influence is powerful only while it is trusted. Once trust fractures, authority must intervene. And when authority intervenes, the illusion of autonomy disappears. Modern finance exists in this narrow space between guidance and control. London operates there with precision, knowing that the most effective power is the one that almost never needs to reveal itself. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.